Okay, so you're trying to get a handle on antibiotics,
Right.
want to understand them better without it feeling like you're drowning in information.
Definitely.
Yeah, makes sense. I think a lot of people are in that boat.
For sure.
We're doing a deep dive today on how we classify these crucial drugs.
Yeah.
We found this really cool resource that breaks down all the different types. And, well, our mission today is pretty simple.
Okay.
We want to give you a clear picture of how they're categorized and why that matters so much. Like why is that foundational knowledge so useful?
Yeah. That's a really great way to put it. Think of it as like building a framework.
Okay.
Antibiotics aren't just like a random assortment of drugs.
Right.
They're organized in a few really key ways. Um, we can talk about their chemical structure first. Like, what are the fundamental building blocks of the drug?
Mm,
Then we can think about how they actually work against bacteria, which is what we call the mechanism of action.
right.
And then finally, we can think about the range of bacteria that the drug can target, and that's known as its spectrum of activity.
Perfect. So let's start with those major classifications.
Mm-mm.
The resource that we're looking at highlights what it calls the major classes of antibiotics. And first up, we've got the beta-lactam antibiotics.
Okay.
And what I think is interesting here is that it includes subgroups that people might have heard of, like penicillins and cephalosporins,
Right.
as well as carbapenems and monobactams.
Exactly. And so what's fascinating about all the beta-lactams is that they all share a core chemical structure. They all have that beta-lactam ring that we were talking about.
Right, yeah.
And this shared structure is so key because it's often how they interfere with the bacteria,
Mhm.
specifically by disrupting the bacteria's ability to build cell walls.
Yeah.
So imagine that like the bacteria's protective armor.
Okay.
And because they all share this sort of vulnerability, bacteria can sometimes develop resistance mechanisms that work against the entire class.
Oh, that's so interesting.
Yeah.
Do they have like a shared weakness based on that shared structure?
Exactly.
Okay, so then we move on to other major classes like aminoglycosides, tetracyclines, and macrolides.
Yeah, those are the big ones. And they have different chemical structures and, importantly, different mechanisms of action.
Okay.
For example, aminoglycosides often work by messing with the bacteria's protein production,
Okay.
which, is essential for them to survive.
Right.
So each of these classes is kind of targeting the bacteria in a unique way.
Gotcha. And then the resource that we have points to other classes of antibiotics, which includes examples like glycopeptides, sulfonamides, quinolones, lincosamides, and oxazolidinones.
Wow, that's a mouthful.
Yeah, it sounds like a pretty diverse landscape.
It's huge. It
Yeah.
really is. Even within that, like, other category, you find such a variety of structures and mechanisms at play, and allows us to target, a wide range of bacterial infections,
Right.
which brings up a really important point for you. Understanding these classifications isn't about memorizing a list. It's about building like a mental map. So when you hear about an antibiotic, knowing its class can give you a clue about how it might work and what kind of infections it's typically used for.
I love that. I think that's such a good point.
Yeah.
Like, it makes so much more sense now. It's not just memorizing. It's like, okay, this is a framework that I can use to understand.
Exactly.
Here's where I think it gets even more interesting. Think about like a mechanic.
Okay.
A mechanic doesn't just see a broken car.
Mm.
They understand the different systems, right? Like
Yeah.
you've got the engines, you've got the transmission, you've got the brakes.
Mm.
Knowing the class of the antibiotic is kind of like knowing which system in the bacterial car is being targeted.
Yeah.
It gives you so much more knowledge than just like knowing the name of the drug.
It's such a great analogy. I love that.
Yeah.
It moves you from simply knowing the names of the antibiotics to actually understanding these underlying principles.
Yeah.
So, like, if you know an infection is caused by a certain type of bacteria and you know which antibiotic classes are effective against that type, you really start to see the logic behind the treatment choices.
Right. That's a really good point.
Yeah.
So the big takeaway here is that antibiotics aren't just one thing.
Mm-hmm.
They're a diverse set of tools that we have to fight bacterial infections.
Absolutely.
And they're categorized in a few key ways by their chemical makeup, how they attack bacteria, and which bacteria they could actually defeat.
Exactly. And by understanding these fundamental classifications, you gain such a powerful framework for understanding and navigating the entire world of antibiotics.
Right.
It helps make sense of why different drugs exist and why they're used in different situations.
I love that. So here's something to consider. The next time you encounter the topic of antibiotics, when you hear the name of one-up, try to place it in one of these major classes that we've discussed.
Yeah.
Does it sound like a beta-lactam?
Right?
Or maybe a macrolide? Even that small act of mental categorization can really solidify your understanding and make you a more informed listener and thinker.
Absolutely.
I think that's a great place to leave it.
I agree.
Thanks for listening.
Thanks, everyone.